Zekthar's hands trembled as he adjusted the recording device before him. The scars across his blue-gray skin told stories of battles that still haunted his dreams. His once proud Vortakian uniform now hung loose on his diminished frame, the medals of honor tarnished and bent from impacts he preferred not to remember. The interview chamber on the neutral station of Kepler-7 felt cold, sterile, nothing like the burning worlds where he had learned to fear a species the galaxy had foolishly underestimated. "State your name and rank for the record," the interviewer requested, her voice professional but not unkind. "Commander Zekthar Moldon of the Vortakian Imperial Fleet, 3rd Assault Division," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of authority even in defeat. "Former commander. I suppose that title means little now that my fleet no longer exists." The interviewer, a Centauri diplomat named Velana, leaned forward slightly. She had heard fragments of what had happened at the human colony worlds, but the full story remained classified at the highest levels. Only a handful of survivors existed to tell the tale, and most refused to speak at all. "Please tell us what happened during what your people called Operation Swift Thunder. Start from the beginning." Zekthar closed his eyes for a moment, and, when he opened them, they held a haunted quality that made even the seasoned diplomat uncomfortable. "The beginning," he repeated softly. "The beginning was our arrogance. We had spent 3,000 years conquering worlds, subjugating species across 17 star systems. The Vortakian Empire was supreme, unstoppable. We had crushed the crystal-based Zelnari, enslaved the gaseous Fentok, and absorbed the remnants of a dozen other civilizations. When our scouts discovered this new species calling themselves humans, we assumed they would be just another easy conquest." He paused, staring at his clawed hands. How wrong we were. The discovery of humanity had been routine, just another entry in the endless catalogue of species encountered by Vortakian expansion fleets. The humans occupied a small cluster of worlds around an unremarkable yellow star they called Sol. Initial observations showed a species barely 500 years into space travel, using primitive chemical rockets and basic fusion drives. Their largest ships were crude mining vessels and colony transports. They had no energy shields, no plasma weaponry, no quantum communication networks. "We classified them as a Level 2 civilization," Zekthar continued. "Barely space-capable, technologically inferior by millennia. Our standard protocol for such species was simple: offer them the choice to join the Empire as a servant race, or face conquest. It had worked on 47 worlds before theirs. The human response had been unlike anything in Vortakian military history. Instead of the expected surrender or desperate last stand, the humans had done something that still puzzled alien strategists across the galaxy: they had asked for time to consider. 3 standard cycles, Zekthar said. They requested 3 cycles to discuss our generous offer among their various nation-states. It seemed reasonable. Most species used the time to prepare surrender ceremonies or gather their most precious artifacts before integration into our empire. We granted their request without suspicion. During those 3 cycles, Vortakian forces had remained at the edge of the human system, conducting routine patrols and scanning the primitive human worlds. What they observed seemed to confirm their initial assessment: increased radio chatter, movement of civilian populations, industrial activity that suggested preparation for either surrender or feudal resistance. Nothing appeared threatening to ships that could reduce entire continents to molten glass. The human fleet that emerged from behind their largest gas giant on the final day had been laughably small. 37 vessels, the largest barely 800 meters long. They moved with the crude efficiency of a species still learning to navigate 3-dimensional space, their ships dark and angular, built for function rather than the graceful curves preferred by more advanced civilizations. "I remember laughing," Zekthar admitted. "My tactical officer made jokes about how quickly we could process them for the slave markets. We had 215 ships, each one capable of destroying their entire fleet single-handed. Our smallest cruiser was larger than their flagship." Admiral Korvash Dekman, Supreme Commander of the 3rd Assault Division, had opened communications with the human fleet expecting the standard surrender protocol. Instead, the response had been delivered by a human who introduced himself simply as Admiral Chen. He was old for their species, Zekthar recalled, with graying hair and scars on his face that suggested personal combat experience. Most advanced civilizations had moved beyond physical conflict millennia ago. When Admiral Korvash demanded their surrender, this Chen looked directly into the communication screen and said something that still echoes in my mind. The human's words had been simple: "Admiral, we appreciate your offer, but humanity must respectfully decline. We've spent the last 3 months preparing our response. I think you'll find it adequate." What followed challenged everything the Vortakian Empire understood about warfare, technology, and the nature of intelligence itself. The human ships had not advanced in the elegant formations preferred by civilized warfare. Instead, they had scattered across three-dimensional space in what appeared to be random directions, their primitive engines producing visible exhaust trails that any competent military would have recognized as wasteful and revealing. "We moved to intercept them with contempt rather than caution," Zekthar said. "It was meant to be a demonstration, a way to show them the futility of resistance before we allowed survivors to surrender." Admiral Korvash ordered the first wave to disable their ships rather than destroy them. He wanted prisoners for interrogation about their industrial capacity. The lead squadron of Vortakian destroyers had moved within optimal firing range, their plasma batteries charging with the distinctive whine that had announced doom to countless worlds. The human ships continued their apparently panicked flight, making no attempt to return fire with whatever primitive weapons they might possess. Then, the space between the fleets had suddenly filled with objects. "At first, our sensors couldn't classify them," Zekthar explained. "They were too small to be ships, too large to be natural debris, and moving too fast for our targeting systems to track effectively. Thousands of them launched from the human vessels during their retreat. Our tactical computers struggled to process what they were seeing. The objects had been moving at significant fractions of light speed, far faster than anything a level 2 civilization should have been capable of producing. As they closed with the Vortakian formation, their nature became terrifyingly clear. Kinetic projectiles," Zekthar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Solid chunks of metal and ceramic, some no larger than my fist, others the size of shuttlecraft. But moving at velocities that transformed them into weapons more devastating than our most powerful plasma cannons. The first impacts had been almost anticlimactic. No explosions, no brilliant energy discharges, just sudden holes appearing in the hulls of Vortakian warships. Then, the secondary effects had begun as the projectiles, their kinetic energy barely diminished by passing through advanced armor, continued through internal compartments, severing power conduits, rupturing atmosphere containment, and turning sophisticated equipment into shrapnel. The destroyer Tokmiran simply came apart," Zekthar continued. "A projectile no larger than a personal transport pierced its reactor containment. The explosion took 2 other ships with it. In the span of 30 seconds, we lost more vessels than in the previous 5 campaigns combined." The human tactic had been devastatingly simple. While Vortakian military doctrine focused on energy weapons and defensive shielding, the humans had weaponized basic physics. Their ships were essentially massive kinetic platforms, using gravity assists and fusion drives to accelerate projectiles to horrific velocities before launching them across interplanetary distances. "We tried to adapt," Zekthar said. "Our energy shields were designed to deflect plasma and particle beams, not solid matter moving at those speeds. The projectiles passed through our defenses as if they didn't exist. We increased evasive maneuvers, but the humans had calculated intercept vectors across multiple probable courses. They weren't aiming at where we were, but where we would be." The engagement had lasted 18 minutes. When it ended, 43 Vortakian ships had been destroyed or disabled, while the human fleet had suffered only minor damage from a few plasma bolts that had found their mark. The tactical advantage that had secured Vortakian dominance across 17 systems had been negated by a species using principles their own children learned in basic physics classes. But the kinetic bombardment had been only the beginning of humanity's response. "While we were trying to understand what had happened to our fleet, the humans began their real attack," Zekthar said. "They didn't target our ships. They targeted our infrastructure." The Vortakian invasion force had established a standard occupation framework around the human system: supply depots, communication relays, processing facilities for extracting resources from captured worlds. These installations were heavily shielded and defended, positioned in space where they could support the main fleet while remaining secure from counterattack. The humans had studied them carefully during their 3 cycles of preparation. "They came at us from directions we thought were impossible," Zekthar explained. "Small craft, barely larger than personal shuttles, moving on vectors that took them through asteroid fields and radiation zones where our sensors couldn't track them effectively. We assumed nothing could survive passage through such hazardous space. The human infiltration teams had not only survived, they had used the hazardous conditions as camouflage. Their ships were built to withstand radiation and micrometeor impacts that would have crippled more sophisticated vessels. When they emerged from the cosmic noise, they were already inside the defensive perimeters of critical installations. They didn't try to fight our defense platforms, Zekthar said. Instead, they attacked the installations themselves with weapons we had never encountered before. Chemical explosives. Primitive by our standards, but incredibly effective when placed precisely against structural weaknesses. The human assault teams had demonstrated an understanding of Vortakian technology that should have been impossible for a Level 2 civilization. They knew which support struts to target to cause catastrophic structural failure, which computer systems to disable to blind entire sections of the defensive network, which power conduits to sever to create cascading failures throughout the installations. We learned later that they had been studying our technology from the moment we entered their system, Zekthar continued. Every communication, every scanner pulse, every energy emission from our ships had been analyzed and catalogued. They understood our systems better than some of our own technicians. The destruction of the supply infrastructure had been methodical and devastating. Within 6 hours, the Vortakian fleet found itself operating without resupply, without long-range communication with the Empire, and without the processing facilities needed to extract resources from the system they were attempting to conquer. Admiral Korvash tried to maintain formation and continue the attack, Zekthar said. But the humans weren't finished with us. They had one more surprise. The final phase of the human response had begun as the Vortakian fleet regrouped and prepared for a direct assault on the human homeworld. Long-range sensors had detected movement throughout the system as human ships converged on Earth's orbital space. The concentration of their forces suggested they intended to make their final stand in defense of their primary world. We thought we were forcing them into exactly the position we wanted, Zekthar admitted. A concentrated target that we could eliminate with overwhelming firepower. Admiral Korvash ordered a full assault, everything we had remaining focused on breaking their last defense. The Vortakian fleet had advanced in standard battle formation, 200 surviving ships arranged in the elegant geometric patterns that had dominated space combat for millennia. Their plasma batteries were charged to full power, their targeting systems locked onto the human formation, their crews prepared for the final victory that would add another species to the Empire's catalogue of conquests. The humans had been waiting. They let us get close, Zekthar said. Close enough that we could see their ships clearly, close enough that our weapons were at maximum effectiveness. Then, they activated something we had never seen before. The space around Earth had suddenly erupted in brilliant points of light as hundreds of previously hidden installations revealed themselves. Orbital platforms, asteroid bases, converted space stations, even what appeared to be modified mining equipment, all simultaneously powering up weapon systems that defied everything the Vortakians thought they knew about human technology. They had turned their entire system into a fortress, Zekthar explained. Every moon, every asteroid, every piece of space debris large enough to hold a weapon platform. The 3 cycles we gave them for consideration wasn't used for surrender preparations. It was used to prepare the most elaborate defensive network we had ever encountered. The human defense platforms had opened fire with the same kinetic weapons that had devastated the first attack, but on a scale that transformed the space around their homeworld into a killing field. Millions of projectiles, launched from thousands of hidden positions, created a 3-dimensional barrier of destruction that no ship could survive. We couldn't retreat, Zekthar said. We couldn't advance. We couldn't even maintain formation. The projectiles were coming from every direction, calculated to intersect at points where our ships would be regardless of evasive action. It was like being trapped inside a machine designed specifically for destroying fleets. The Battle of Sol, as human historians would later name it, lasted 47 minutes. When the kinetic storm finally ended, the 3rd Assault Division of the Vortakian Imperial Fleet had ceased to exist as an effective military force. 215 ships had been reduced to 17 damaged survivors, drifting in space with life support failing and engines destroyed. Zekthar had been commanding the cruiser NALTHYSS when a projectile the size of a personal transport had pierced its reactor shielding. The explosion that followed had killed most of his crew and left him trapped in the command section with failing atmosphere and no hope of rescue. I expected to die there, he said simply. It would have been a warrior's death, dying in battle against a worthy enemy. But the humans had other plans. The rescue had come from the species they had intended to conquer. Human ships, those same primitive vessels that had seemed laughably inferior just hours before, had moved through the debris field of the destroyed Vortakian fleet. But, instead of finishing off the survivors, they had begun rescue operations. They saved us, Zekthar said, wonder still evident in his voice after all this time. The species we had come to enslave, whose worlds we intended to strip of resources, whose people we plan to subjugate or eliminate. They pulled us from our dying ships and treated our wounds and gave us food and medical care. The human rescue teams had worked with efficiency that spoke of extensive preparation and training. They had atmospheric processors to provide breathable air for multiple alien species, medical equipment capable of treating non-human physiology, and translation systems that allowed communication with their former enemies. I asked one of their medical technicians why they were helping us, Zekthar recalled. She looked at me with these strange human eyes and said, "Because you needed help." As if it was the most obvious thing in the universe. The 17 surviving ships and their crews had been taken to human medical facilities where they received treatment that surpassed anything available in the Vortakian Empire. The humans had studied captured Vortakian technology and biological samples during their 3 cycles of preparation, not just to understand their weaknesses, but to understand their medical needs. They knew more about treating Vortakian battle injuries than our own field medics, Zekthar admitted. They had prepared for casualties on both sides. The interviews that followed had been conducted with the same efficiency the humans brought to everything else. They were methodical, thorough, and surprisingly gentle. The human interrogators wanted to understand Vortakian military doctrine, the structure of the empire, and the decision-making process that had led to the invasion of their system. They never used torture or coercion, Zekthar said. They simply asked questions and listened to our answers. When we explained how the Empire operated, how we had conquered other worlds, they took careful notes. They were learning about us the same way they had learned about our technology. The humans had been preparing for something far beyond the defense of their own system. As Zekthar's interview continued in the cold chamber of Kepler 7 station, the weight of what he had witnessed settled over him once again. The humans had not simply defeated a Vortakian fleet. They had demonstrated capabilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions about technological development, military strategy, and the nature of intelligence itself. "You have to understand," he said to Valana, "the Vortakian Empire has conquered 47 worlds. We have faced every type of resistance imaginable. But the humans were different. They didn't just fight us. They understood us better than we understood ourselves." The interviewer made notes on her datapad, but Zekthar could see the skepticism in her expression. The story seemed impossible, a fantasy created by a defeated military commander trying to excuse his failure. "You don't believe me," he said. "I can see it in your eyes. How could a level 2 civilization defeat the 3rd Assault Division? How could primitive chemical rockets and kinetic weapons overcome plasma cannons and energy shields?" Valana set down her stylus and met his gaze directly. "Commander, I've read the preliminary reports. The debris field around the human system has been analyzed by 17 different species. The wreckage of Vortakian ships shows damage consistent with your description. But what puzzles everyone is how the humans knew exactly what to do." Zekthar nodded slowly. "That's the question that kept me awake during my recovery. How did they know our weaknesses so precisely? How did they understand our technology so quickly? How did they prepare such an elaborate defense in only 3 cycles?" He leaned forward, his scarred hands gripping the edge of the table. "I learned the answer during my interviews with their military commanders. It's something that should terrify every advanced civilization in the galaxy. The truth about humanity's preparation for the Vortakian invasion would challenge everything the galactic community believed about the development of intelligence and the nature of technological progress. But that revelation would have to wait. The humans didn't just defend themselves," Zekthar said quietly. "They studied us. They learned from us. And, when they released me and the other survivors, they sent us back with a message for the Empire." He reached into his uniform and withdrew a small device, placing it on the table between them. They wanted to make sure the Empire understood exactly what they had encountered at Sol. "This contains everything: tactical analysis, technological specifications, strategic assessments. Everything the Empire needs to know about human capabilities." Valana stared at the device. "They gave you intelligence about their own military capabilities?" "They wanted the Empire to make an informed decision about any future contact," Zekthar replied. "The humans had studied our history, our expansion patterns, our treatment of conquered species. They knew the Empire would eventually return with a larger force unless they understood exactly what they would be facing. The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. A species that could not only defeat a vastly superior military force, but could do so while simultaneously preparing to share the secrets of their victory with their enemies. But that's not the most disturbing part of their message, Zekthar continued. They didn't just send technical data. They sent a proposal. The proposal the humans had sent back with the survivors was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Zekthar pulled up the holographic display from the device, its blue light casting strange shadows across his scarred features. The text appeared in 17 different languages, including perfect High Vortakian that demonstrated an understanding of linguistic nuances that had taken the Empire centuries to master. They offered to teach us, Zekthar said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and fear. The species we had come to conquer, whose worlds we intended to strip bare, whose people we planned to enslave. They wanted to share their knowledge with us. Velana's stylus clattered to the table. In 3,000 years of galactic diplomacy, no conquered species had ever offered to educate their conquerors. The very concept violated every principle of interstellar relations that civilized worlds had established. What kind of knowledge? She asked. Zekthar manipulated the display, bringing up technical schematics that made the Centauri diplomats' eyes widen. The diagram showed kinetic weapon systems, orbital defense networks, and something called adaptive military doctrine that promised to revolutionize warfare across the galaxy. They called it defensive technology sharing, Zekthar explained. The humans claimed that their defensive capabilities were so effective that they preferred to share them with potential aggressors rather than face the necessity of using them offensively. The human logic had been devastatingly simple. By sharing their defensive technologies with other species, they would eliminate the advantage that aggressive civilizations held over peaceful ones. If every world could defend itself as effectively as Earth, the incentive for conquest would disappear entirely. But there was a condition, Zekthar continued. The technology could only be used for defensive purposes. Any species that attempted to weaponize human innovations for conquest would face immediate intervention. The threat had been delivered in the same calm, matter-of-fact tone that characterized all human communications. There was no bluster, no dramatic declarations of superior power. Just a simple statement of policy that carried implications vast enough to reshape galactic civilization. They weren't threatening to destroy aggressive species, Zekthar said. They were threatening to make aggression impossible. The Empire's response to the human proposal had been predictable. Admiral Korvash, despite his defeat, had recommended immediate retaliation with a force large enough to overwhelm any defensive network. The humans' demonstration of technological capability only proved that Earth represented a threat to imperial expansion that needed to be eliminated quickly. The 2nd Assault Division was assembled within one standard cycle, Zekthar said. 500 ships, including 3 dreadnoughts and our most advanced weapons systems. Admiral Wechthos commanded the operation personally. He was considered the Empire's greatest military strategist. The 2nd Assault Division had approached the Sol system with every precaution that military science could devise. Long-range reconnaissance had mapped the defensive network the humans had revealed during the first battle, identifying thousands of weapon platforms and computing interception vectors for every known kinetic launcher. We thought we understood their capabilities, Zekthar said. Our analysis showed that their defensive network, while impressive, had limitations. The kinetic weapons required precise timing and trajectory calculations. If we could approach from multiple vectors simultaneously, using unpredictable flight patterns, we could overwhelm their targeting systems. The human response to the 2nd Assault Division had been immediate and unexpected. Instead of powering up their defensive platforms or repositioning their fleet, they had transmitted a single message across all communication frequencies. "Welcome back," the transmission had said. "We hoped you would return so we could demonstrate our progress." The word progress had carried implications that sent chills through the Imperial command structure. In the cycles since the first battle, the humans had not been passive. They had been learning, adapting, and improving their capabilities with a speed that defied every model of technological development. The attack began exactly as Admiral Wechthos planned, Zekthar recalled. 500 ships approaching from 17 different vectors, using evasive patterns that our best computers had calculated would make targeting impossible. For the first few minutes, it seemed the plan was working. The human defensive network had indeed seemed overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of the Imperial assault. Kinetic projectiles filled space around the fleet, but the majority missed their targets as Vortakian ships twisted through three-dimensional evasion patterns that had been perfected over centuries of warfare. Then, the humans activated something new, Zekthar said quietly. The space around Earth had suddenly filled with objects that defied immediate classification. They moved like ships but behaved like weapons, darting between Imperial vessels with impossible agility while launching projectiles with accuracy that no organic crew could achieve. Drones, Zekthar explained. Thousands of autonomous vehicles, each one equipped with kinetic weapons and guidance systems that could predict our evasive maneuvers in real time. They moved like living creatures, but with precision that only machines could achieve. The drone swarms had torn through the Imperial formation with ruthless efficiency. Unlike the fixed defensive platforms of the first battle, these mobile weapons could adapt to changing tactical situations, pursuing fleeing ships and coordinating attacks that eliminated entire squadrons in seconds. They learned from our first engagement, Zekthar said. Every evasive pattern we had used, every tactical formation, every weakness they had observed. They programmed all of it into their autonomous systems and waited for us to return. The Battle of Sol 2 had lasted 31 minutes. When it ended, the 2nd Assault Division had been reduced to debris and a handful of escape pods containing survivors too stunned to comprehend what had happened to them. But the humans had not been finished demonstrating their progress. While Admiral Wechthos was trying to understand how his fleet had been destroyed so quickly, the humans launched their own offensive, Zekthar said. Not against our remaining ships, but against Imperial territory itself. The human attack fleet that emerged from the outer reaches of the Sol system consisted of only 12 vessels, but they moved with purpose that spoke of careful planning and thorough preparation. Their destination was not in doubt, the Imperial fortress world of Kethmar, 3 systems away. Kethmar was considered impregnable, Zekthar explained. Orbital defense platforms, planetary shields, a garrison fleet of 200 ships. It was the staging area for our expansion into this sector of the galaxy. If the humans could actually threaten Kethmar, it would mean they possessed offensive capabilities that matched their defensive ones. The human fleet had approached the Kethmar system using the same principles that had guided their defense of Earth: careful analysis of enemy capabilities, precise application of overwhelming force, and technological innovations that transformed standard military doctrine into obsolete theory. They didn't attack the defense platforms or engage the garrison fleet, Zekthar said. Instead, they demonstrated something we had never seen before: instantaneous communication across interstellar distances. The human ships had somehow coordinated their assault with perfect timing despite being separated by light minutes of space. Their attacks struck the orbital installations and planetary infrastructure simultaneously, suggesting communication technologies that violated everything the Empire understood about physics. Our scientists still don't understand how they achieved instantaneous coordination, Zekthar admitted. Quantum entanglement was theoretical even for our most advanced research divisions. But the humans were using it as a practical military tool. The assault on Kethmar had lasted 6 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of the Imperial presence in the system. The garrison fleet had been eliminated, the orbital platforms reduced to debris, and the planetary defenses neutralized without a single human ship being lost. But the most shocking aspect of the human attack had not been their military success. It had been their treatment of the defeated Imperial forces. They offered medical aid to our wounded, rescue services for survivors, and safe passage to Imperial territory for anyone who wished to leave, Zekthar said. The garrison commander reported that human medical teams were treating Vortakian injuries with the same care they would provide to their own people. The human occupation of Kethmar had lasted exactly 72 hours. During that time, they had systematically dismantled every piece of military equipment on the planet while simultaneously upgrading the civilian infrastructure with technologies that improved life for the Vortakian colonists. They replaced our mining equipment with more efficient systems, Zekthar explained. They upgraded power generation, improved water purification, enhanced agricultural productivity. When they left, Kethmar was more prosperous than it had been under Imperial rule. The message was clear: humans possessed the capability to conquer Imperial worlds, but they preferred to improve them. The demonstration had profound implications for every aggressive civilization in the galaxy. That's when the Empire realized we weren't facing a primitive species defending their homeworld, Zekthar said. We were facing something completely new, a civilization that was more advanced than us but had chosen to appear primitive until threatened. The Imperial response had been swift and desperate. Every available ship was recalled to core Imperial space, defensive positions were reinforced, and emergency research programs were initiated to develop countermeasures against human technology. But the humans didn't press their advantage, Zekthar continued. Instead, they sent another message to the Imperial Council. This second message had been even more disturbing than the first. The humans offered not just defensive technology sharing, but active assistance in improving Imperial civilization. They promised to help upgrade Vortakian worlds with better infrastructure, more efficient resource extraction, and technologies that could support larger populations without environmental degradation. They wanted to help us become better, Zekthar said simply. Not just militarily, but as a civilization. They offered to share knowledge that could eliminate poverty, disease, and resource scarcity throughout the Empire. The only condition remained the same: the technology could not be used for aggressive purposes against other species. Any attempt to weaponize human innovations would result in immediate intervention. The Imperial Council spent months debating their response, Zekthar recalled. Some members argued for accepting the human offer and transforming the Empire into something unprecedented, a galactic civilization dedicated to improvement rather than conquest. Others demanded continued military action to eliminate what they saw as an existential threat to Imperial expansion. The debate had been settled by intelligence reports from the frontier worlds. Human ships had been observed throughout Imperial space, not attacking but studying. They were mapping Imperial infrastructure, analyzing Vortakian technology, and learning everything they needed to know about the civilization they had offered to help. They weren't waiting for our answer, Zekthar said. They were preparing to implement their proposal whether we agreed or not. The third and final assault on the Sol system had been the largest military operation in Vortakian history. Every ship the Empire could muster, every weapon system that could be deployed, every ally that could be convinced to join the effort. 1,500 vessels from 7 different species, coordinated by the greatest military minds the Empire had ever produced. Admiral Zorvok Helthane commanded the operation, Zekthar said. He was a legend, a strategist who had conquered more worlds than any other Imperial commander. If anyone could devise a way to defeat the humans, it would be him. Admiral Helthane's strategy had been based on overwhelming force applied with such speed and violence that human defensive capabilities would be irrelevant. The combined fleet would emerge from hyperspace at multiple points around the Sol system simultaneously, creating a sphere of destruction that would eliminate human civilization before it could respond. The plan was flawless in theory, Zekthar said. 1,500 ships attacking from every direction at once, targeting not just military installations but every human world, every space station, every asteroid base. Complete annihilation delivered in minutes. The execution of the plan had been perfect. The Imperial fleet had emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, weapons charged, targeting systems locked onto every significant human presence in the system. For a brief moment, it seemed that Admiral Helthane had achieved the impossible, complete tactical surprise against a species that had demonstrated uncanny ability to anticipate Imperial strategy. Then, we realized the humans were gone, Zekthar said quietly. The Sol system had been empty. No defensive platforms, no orbital stations, no ships, no signs of life on any of the human worlds. The massive fleet that had assembled to destroy human civilization found nothing to destroy. Admiral Helthane ordered a complete search of the system, Zekthar continued. Sensors swept every asteroid, every moon, every piece of debris larger than a personal transport. The humans had vanished completely, taking their technology and their civilization with them. The mystery had been solved when scanners detected structures on the planets that remained. Not human structures, but something else entirely. The investigation teams that landed on Earth made discoveries that challenged everything the Empire thought it knew about the universe. The humans had left messages, Zekthar said. Not just communication devices, but entire installations dedicated to teaching anyone who found them about human civilization, human technology, and human philosophy. The abandoned human worlds had been transformed into vast educational complexes containing libraries of knowledge that spanned every field of science and technology imaginable. But, more than technical information, they contained something unprecedented: the complete history and culture of a species that had chosen to disappear rather than wage war. They explained why they left, Zekthar said. The humans had decided that their presence in the galaxy was causing more harm than good. As long as they remained in known space, aggressive civilizations would view them as a threat to be eliminated. So they chose to remove themselves from the equation. The human message had been clear and heartbreaking. They had withdrawn to unknown regions of space, taking their technology and their civilization with them. But they had left behind everything needed for other species to follow their example, to choose cooperation over conquest, improvement over exploitation, progress over power. They trusted us, Zekthar said, his voice barely above a whisper. A species that had come to enslave them, that had attacked them 3 times with increasingly devastating force, that had never shown them anything but hostility. They trusted us with the knowledge to become better than we were. The aftermath of the human disappearance had transformed galactic civilization in ways that were still being felt cycles later. Species that had spent millennia in constant warfare suddenly found themselves with access to technologies that made conflict obsolete. The knowledge left behind by humanity offered solutions to every major problem facing galactic civilization: energy scarcity, environmental degradation, population pressure, resource conflict. The Empire officially disbanded within 5 cycles, Zekthar said. Not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer necessary. When every world can defend itself perfectly and resources can be created rather than seized, conquest becomes pointless. The transformation had not been immediate or universal. Some species had attempted to weaponize human technology for aggressive purposes, only to discover that the systems would not function when used against other civilizations. The safeguards built into the transformation had not been immediate or universal. Some species had attempted to weaponize human technology for aggressive purposes, only to discover that the systems would not function when used against other civilizations. The safeguards built into human technology were more sophisticated than anything the galaxy had ever encountered. The Korvac Dominion tried first, Zekthar continued, his scarred hands moving restlessly across the table surface. They had always been the Empire's most aggressive rivals, controlling 12 systems through pure military might. When they gained access to human defensive technologies, they immediately began modifying them for offensive use. The Korvac military engineers had worked for months, attempting to reverse-engineer human kinetic weapons and drone systems. Their efforts had met with initial success, creating prototype weapons that seemed to function exactly like the systems that had destroyed Imperial fleets. Test firings against uninhabited asteroids had produced devastating results that promised to revolutionize Korvac military doctrine. They launched an assault against the Zelnari crystal worlds 3 cycles later, Zekthar said. 50 ships equipped with modified human weapons, confident that they possessed overwhelming technological advantage. The attack lasted exactly 17 minutes. The human-derived weapons had functioned perfectly until the moment they were used against living beings. Then, every system had simultaneously failed. Kinetic launchers had jammed, guidance systems had shut down, power conduits had severed themselves. The Korvac fleet had found itself defenseless in the middle of a combat zone, their crews struggling to understand why their technology had betrayed them. The Zelnari, who had been expecting annihilation, instead found themselves facing an enemy armed with nothing more effective than conventional plasma weapons, Zekthar explained. It was almost comical, if you could ignore the deeper implications. The Korvac survivors had reported that their ship's computer systems had displayed a simple message before shutting down: this technology is designated for defensive use only. Aggressive applications are prohibited. Please refer to educational materials for proper implementation guidelines. The humans had somehow programmed their technology to recognize aggressive intent, Zekthar said, wonder still evident in his voice. Not just the weapons themselves, but the fundamental principles that made them function. It was impossible to use human innovations for conquest because they were designed at a quantum level to prevent such applications. Similar incidents had occurred throughout the galaxy as various species attempted to exploit human technology for military advantage. Each attempt had ended in the same result: complete system failure accompanied by politely worded error messages suggesting alternative applications. The Fentok gas dwellers tried to weaponize human atmospheric processors for use against oxygen-breathing species, Zekthar recalled. The systems worked perfectly for environmental enhancement but refused to function when configured for biological warfare. The Velnari attempted to modify human instantaneous communication technology for military coordination, only to discover that it would only transmit messages related to peaceful cooperation. The safeguards had been so comprehensive that they had effectively made war impossible for any civilization that adopted human technology. Species could defend themselves with perfect efficiency, but they could not attack others without reverting to pre-human weapons that were vastly inferior to the defensive systems now available to every world. That's when we began to understand what the humans had really done, Zekthar said. They hadn't just shared defensive technology. They had fundamentally altered the nature of galactic civilization by making aggression technologically impossible. The implications had been staggering. For the first time in recorded history, defensive capabilities so vastly exceeded offensive ones that conquest was no longer a viable strategy for any species. Worlds that had lived in constant fear of invasion suddenly found themselves completely secure, free to develop their civilizations without the need for military expenditure. The change wasn't just technological, Zekthar continued. It was philosophical. When aggression becomes impossible, cooperation becomes inevitable. The first interspecies research cooperative had been established within 2 cycles of the human disappearance. The Vortakian Empire, the Krorvak Dominion, and the Zelnari Crystal Collective had found themselves sharing scientific data for the first time in history, not because they had become peaceful, but because cooperation was the only way to understand the technology that now protected all of them. We discovered that human innovations were even more sophisticated than we had initially realized, Zekthar said. Their defensive systems didn't just protect against physical attack. They prevented economic warfare, biological weapons, psychological manipulation, even social engineering on a civilizational scale. The human technology had somehow learned to recognize and counter every form of aggression that galactic species had ever developed. Trade blockades failed when human-derived transportation systems refused to honor embargo restrictions. Biological weapons became inert when exposed to human atmospheric processors. Propaganda systems shut down when programmed to spread information intended to destabilize other civilizations. It was as if the humans had catalogued every possible method of causing harm and engineered specific countermeasures for each one, Zekthar explained. But, more than that, they had somehow encoded their own values into the technology itself. The systems didn't just prevent harm, they actively promoted cooperation and mutual benefit. The most remarkable example had been the transformation of the former imperial mining colonies. These worlds had been stripped of resources for centuries, their environments devastated, and their populations reduced to subsistence levels. When human agricultural and industrial technologies were implemented, the results had exceeded every projection. Worlds that had been barren wastelands became garden paradises within a single cycle, Zekthar said. The human systems didn't just restore environmental damage, they created ecosystems more diverse and productive than had existed before industrial development. It was like watching the galaxy heal itself. But the healing had not been limited to environmental recovery. The social transformations had been equally dramatic as species that had been enemies for millennia found themselves working together to implement human innovations. The Krorvak and Zelnari had been at war for 3,000 years, Zekthar recalled. Their conflict had been so bitter that neither species could even communicate without translators because their languages had evolved specifically to exclude the other's linguistic patterns. But human communication technology required cooperative input from multiple operators to function at full efficiency. The practical necessity of cooperation had gradually overcome centuries of hatred. Krorvak and Zelnari technicians had been forced to work together to maintain the systems that protected both their civilizations. Over time, the cooperation had expanded beyond mere technical necessity to genuine collaboration on research and development projects. We learned later that this was intentional, Zekthar said. The humans had studied our history, our conflicts, our psychological patterns. They had designed their technology to require the kind of cooperation that would gradually transform our civilizations. The human influence had extended far beyond technology. The educational materials they had left behind contained not just technical specifications, but detailed analyses of galactic civilization that revealed patterns no single species had ever recognized. They showed us things about ourselves that we had never seen, Zekthar explained. The Empire's expansion patterns, for example. We had always viewed our conquests as random opportunities arising from military superiority. But the humans demonstrated that our expansion followed predictable psychological and economic patterns that could be redirected toward peaceful exploration and development. The human analysis had revealed that aggressive expansion was typically driven by resource scarcity, population pressure, and social stratification. By providing technologies that eliminated scarcity and promoted social equality, they had addressed the root causes of interstellar conflict rather than merely its symptoms. They understood us better than we understood ourselves, Zekthar said. Every species in the galaxy, every civilization we had encountered. The humans had studied our histories, our cultures, our motivations, and our fears. They had crafted their response not just to defeat our fleets, but to help us become better than we had been. The most disturbing aspect of the human departure had been the realization that they had planned it from the beginning. Evidence found in their abandoned installations suggested that the entire sequence of events, from first contact through final disappearance, had been carefully orchestrated to produce the maximum positive impact on galactic civilization. They had never intended to remain in known space, Zekthar said. Their defensive preparations, their technological demonstrations, even their offers of cooperation. All of it was designed to introduce concepts and capabilities that would transform galactic civilization before they departed. The human strategy had been based on a profound understanding of interstellar psychology. By demonstrating superior defensive capabilities while maintaining a peaceful stance, they had shown that security could be achieved without aggression. By sharing their technology freely while building in safeguards against misuse, they had proven that cooperation was more beneficial than competition. They gave us a choice, Zekthar continued. Not between surrender and destruction, but between remaining what we were and becoming something better. They made that choice obvious by demonstrating the benefits of cooperation while making the costs of aggression prohibitive. The choice had not been difficult once the implications became clear. Civilizations that adopted human technology experienced unprecedented prosperity, security, and social development. Those that rejected it found themselves increasingly isolated as their neighbors transformed into post-scarcity societies with no interest in conflict. The Murdoch hegemony was the last to accept human influence, Zekthar recalled. They held out for 7 cycles, attempting to maintain their aggressive expansion using conventional technology. But they found themselves facing defensive systems they could not overcome and surrounded by civilizations that had no need for the resources they sought to seize. The Murdoch transformation had been particularly dramatic because their society had been entirely built around military conquest. When their aggressive capabilities became obsolete, they had been forced to completely restructure their civilization around peaceful principles. The process took 3 cycles and resulted in the most prosperous society in known space, Zekthar said. Former military commanders became exploration leaders, discovering new worlds not to conquer but to study and preserve. Their warrior culture transformed into a conservation culture dedicated to protecting rare ecosystems and endangered species. Similar transformations had occurred throughout the galaxy as species discovered that human technology rewarded cooperation while making aggression impossible. The result had been an unprecedented period of galactic peace and prosperity that historians would later call the Great Transformation. But the humans didn't abandon us completely, Zekthar said, his voice taking on a tone of deep respect. They left behind something more valuable than technology or knowledge. They left behind proof that intelligence could evolve beyond aggression, that civilizations could choose cooperation over conquest, that progress was possible without exploitation. The proof had come in the form of continued contact from human exploration fleets operating in distant regions of the galaxy. These contacts were rare and brief, usually consisting of scientific data about previously unknown phenomena or warnings about potential hazards in unexplored space. But they served as reminders that humanity continued to exist and to watch over the civilizations they had transformed. The last confirmed human contact was 3 cycles ago, Zekthar said. A research vessel encountered a human exploration ship near the galactic core. The humans shared data about a stellar phenomenon that could have threatened 7 systems if it had gone undetected. They refused all offers of supplies or assistance, saying only that they were well and that they were proud of what we had accomplished. The human message had been simple but profound. They had not abandoned the galaxy, but had chosen to remove themselves as a destabilizing factor while continuing to help in ways that did not interfere with natural development. They had become guardians rather than conquerors, protectors rather than rulers. That's what made them truly terrifying, Zekthar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Not their weapons, not their technology, not even their ability to disappear when they chose to. What made them terrifying was their fundamental decency in the face of species that had shown them nothing but hostility. The human response to 3 massive military assaults had been to offer assistance to their attackers. Their reaction to threats of annihilation had been to provide the tools necessary for their enemies to become better civilizations. Their solution to galactic warfare had been to make peace more profitable than conflict while ensuring that aggression became technologically impossible. They could have destroyed us, Zekthar continued. Any one of our fleets, all of our fleets, the entire empire, every aggressive civilization in the galaxy. They demonstrated capabilities that made our most advanced weapons seem primitive. But they chose to save us from ourselves instead. The human legacy had transformed not just technology and politics, but the fundamental understanding of what intelligence could accomplish. They had proven that a truly advanced civilization would choose to help its enemies rather than destroy them, that the highest form of victory was to make enemies into friends. The battlefront wasn't pure hell because of the weapons or the destruction, Zekthar said, his scarred hands trembling slightly as he reached for the recording device. It was pure hell because it forced us to confront what we really were, a civilization so primitive that we mistook kindness for weakness, generosity for foolishness, and love for vulnerability. The interview chamber seemed even colder now, the artificial lighting casting harsh shadows across both their faces. Velana had stopped taking notes, her stylus forgotten as she struggled to process the implications of what she had heard. "Commander," she said quietly, "what happened to you after the humans disappeared? How did you end up here, telling this story to neutral parties instead of reporting to whatever remains of Imperial Command?" Zekthar smiled for the first time during the interview, but it was not a happy expression. "That, Ambassador, brings us to the most important part of the story. What happened when we tried to go home to an empire that no longer existed, carrying knowledge that made our entire civilization obsolete?" He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting a depth of experience that had transformed him from Imperial Commander to something entirely different. The humans had done more than defeat our fleets and transform our technology. They had made it impossible for us to remain the people we had been. And that, perhaps, was their greatest victory of all. The journey back to Imperial space had taken 4 cycles aboard a human transport vessel that defied every principle of starship design the Vortakians understood. Instead of the efficient military geometry preferred by warships, the human vessel resembled a mobile research station filled with laboratories, workshops, and what the crew called social spaces designed for interaction between different species. "They called it the Harmony," Zekthar said, his voice carrying a mixture of irony and respect. "A ship designed specifically for transporting survivors of conflicts back to their homeworlds. The humans had built it after their first encounters with aggressive species, anticipating that they would need to care for defeated enemies. The Harmony had been staffed by humans who specialized in what they termed transition counseling, helping members of aggressive civilizations adapt to the psychological changes required for peaceful coexistence. The concept had been completely foreign to Vortakian military doctrine, which viewed defeated enemies as resources to be exploited rather than individuals to be healed. Dr. Sarah Chen was assigned as my counselor, Zekthar recalled. A descendant of the Admiral Chen who had first communicated with our invasion fleet. She was patient, understanding, and completely uninterested in traditional concepts of victory and defeat. Dr. Chen had spent months helping Zekthar and the other survivors process their experiences. Not the trauma of military defeat, which any competent military psychologist could address, but the deeper psychological impact of encountering a civilization that operated according to principles that challenged everything they had believed about intelligence, progress, and the nature of interstellar relations. She explained that humans had encountered this problem before, Zekthar said. Throughout their own history, they had repeatedly faced the challenge of how to respond to aggression without becoming aggressive themselves. Their solution had been to develop what they called transformative defense strategies that converted enemies into allies by addressing the underlying causes of conflict. The human approach had been based on understanding that aggression typically arose from fear, scarcity, or social dysfunction. By eliminating the conditions that drove aggressive behavior, they could transform hostile civilizations into peaceful ones without the need for permanent military subjugation. Dr. Chin showed me historical examples from their own world, Zekthar continued. Nations that had been bitter enemies for centuries, transformed into close allies through economic cooperation, cultural exchange, and mutual assistance during times of crisis. The same principles they had applied to interstellar relations. The most difficult aspect of the transition had been learning to think beyond the zero-sum logic that dominated imperial culture. Vortakian society had been built on the assumption that one species' gain necessarily meant another species' loss, that resources were finite and must be seized before competitors could claim them. The humans demonstrated that this assumption was false, Zekthar said. Their technologies could create resources rather than simply extract them, generate energy without depleting fuel sources, and support larger populations while improving environmental conditions. Scarcity was not a fundamental law of nature, but a problem that could be solved through cooperation and innovation. The psychological adjustment had been profound and disturbing. Zekthar had spent his entire career as a military officer in a civilization dedicated to expansion through conquest. Learning that conquest was not only unnecessary but counterproductive had required rebuilding his entire understanding of his own identity and purpose. Dr. Chen helped me realize that I had never actually wanted to be a conqueror, Zekthar said quietly. I had joined the Imperial fleet because I wanted to explore the galaxy, to discover new worlds and encounter new forms of life. But our society offered no path for exploration that didn't involve subjugation and exploitation. The human model of exploration had been entirely different. Their ships traveled to distant worlds not to claim them, but to study and preserve them. They encountered new species not as potential subjects, but as potential teachers and colleagues. Their expansion into space had been driven by curiosity rather than greed. They offered me a choice, Zekthar continued. I could return to Imperial space and attempt to reintegrate into a military structure that no longer had a purpose, or I could join their exploration service and spend my remaining years discovering wonders instead of destroying them. The choice had not been difficult, but it had been irreversible. Accepting human values meant abandoning not just Imperial military doctrine, but the entire Vortakian way of life that had been built around the assumption of inevitable conflict between species. 17 of us chose to stay with the humans, Zekthar said. The rest returned to Imperial space carrying the technological gifts and educational materials that would eventually transform Vortakian civilization. But we could not go back to being what we had been before encountering humanity. The human exploration service had been unlike anything in Zekthar's experience. Ships crewed by multiple species working together, missions designed to benefit entire galactic communities rather than individual civilizations, and a command structure based on expertise and consensus rather than authority and hierarchy. My first assignment was surveying the Kepler Nebula for potentially habitable worlds, Zekthar recalled. The survey team included humans, Zelnari, reformed Krorvax, and even former Imperial officers like myself. We spent 2 cycles mapping stellar systems and cataloging lifeforms, sharing our discoveries freely with any civilization that expressed interest. The work had been profoundly satisfying in ways that military conquest had never been. Instead of destroying civilizations, they were helping to preserve them. Instead of seizing resources, they were discovering new ones. Instead of expanding one species' territory, they were expanding everyone's knowledge of the universe. We found 12 potentially habitable worlds and 3 systems with existing life forms that required protection from industrial development, Zekthar said. The information was transmitted to the Galactic Cooperation Council and made available to any species seeking new homes or research opportunities. The Galactic Cooperation Council had been humanity's final gift to the galaxy before their departure. An interstellar organization designed to coordinate peaceful expansion, resource sharing, and conflict resolution using the principles that humans had demonstrated through their own actions. The Council operated according to human-designed protocols that made aggression impossible and cooperation inevitable, Zekthar explained. Decisions were made by consensus among all affected species, resources were distributed according to need rather than military power, and disputes were resolved through arbitration rather than warfare. The transformation of galactic civilization had accelerated once the Council became operational. Species that had been enemies for millennia found themselves working together on projects that benefited everyone. The efficiency gains from cooperation had been so dramatic that most civilizations had achieved post-scarcity economic systems within 5 cycles. The irony was overwhelming, Zekthar said. The Empire had spent 3,000 years conquering worlds to seize their resources, never realizing that cooperation would have provided access to far more resources than conquest ever could. But the transformation had not been without its challenges. Civilizations built around military expansion had struggled to find new purposes once aggression became impossible. Social structures designed to support warfare had required complete reorganization to function in peaceful societies. The most difficult adjustments were psychological, Zekthar continued. Species that had defined themselves through opposition to others had to learn to find identity through creation rather than destruction. Warrior cultures had to become explorer cultures, conqueror societies had to become cooperative ones. The Vortakian Empire had been among the most successful transformations, largely because imperial military doctrine had always emphasized adaptability and strategic thinking. These same qualities had served them well when applied to peaceful pursuits rather than aggressive ones. Former imperial commanders became exploration leaders, using their strategic skills to plan scientific missions rather than military campaigns, Zekthar said. Naval engineers began designing research vessels instead of warships. Intelligence specialists started studying galactic phenomena instead of enemy weaknesses. The human influence had extended beyond mere technological and social transformation. They had somehow managed to alter the fundamental trajectory of galactic evolution, steering it away from the endless cycles of conquest and conflict that had characterized interstellar relations for millennia. They had studied our entire galactic civilization as if it were a single organism, Zekthar explained. They understood the patterns of expansion, the cycles of warfare, the economic and psychological forces that drove interstellar conflict. Their intervention had been designed not just to stop the immediate threat we represented, but to redirect the entire galaxy toward a more sustainable and productive evolutionary path. The evidence for this comprehensive understanding had been found in the educational materials left behind on human worlds. These contain not just technological specifications, but detailed analyses of galactic history that revealed patterns no single species had ever recognized. They showed us that interstellar warfare followed predictable cycles, Zekthar said. Aggressive expansion would eventually encounter resistance, leading to increasingly destructive conflicts that consumed resources faster than they could be acquired. The logical endpoint was civilizational collapse or mutual annihilation. The human solution had been to break these cycles by making aggressive expansion impossible while providing alternative paths to prosperity and security. Species that might have spent centuries locked in destructive warfare could instead focus their energies on exploration, scientific advancement, and cultural development. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, Zekthar continued. Within 10 cycles, galactic civilization had achieved technological capabilities that would have taken centuries under the old system of competitive development. Scientific discoveries were shared freely, leading to breakthrough advances in every field of knowledge. The most remarkable achievements had been in the areas of environmental restoration and life preservation. Species that had previously strip-mined entire worlds for resources now worked together to restore damaged ecosystems and protect endangered life forms. The Vortakian mining worlds became nature preserves, Zekthar said with obvious pride. Worlds that had been reduced to barren rock were transformed into thriving ecosystems that supported more life than had existed before industrial development. It was like watching the galaxy heal itself. The healing had extended beyond environmental restoration to social and cultural renaissance. Species that had focused their creative energies on developing more efficient weapons began producing art, literature, and music that reflected their new understanding of their place in the galaxy. The most beautiful expressions came from former warrior cultures, Zekthar observed. The Krorvak began composing symphonies that captured the grandeur of stellar phenomena they had previously sought to destroy. Vortakian poets wrote epics celebrating cooperation and discovery rather than conquest and domination. The cultural transformation had been as profound as the technological one. Civilizations that had measured progress in terms of territory conquered and enemies defeated began measuring it in terms of knowledge gained and life preserved. The change had been reflected in everything from education systems to artistic expression to religious and philosophical traditions. But perhaps the most significant change was in how we viewed ourselves, Zekthar said. The humans had shown us that intelligence could evolve beyond aggression, that civilization could advance beyond exploitation, that progress was possible without causing harm to others. This revelation had sparked philosophical and religious movements throughout the galaxy as species grappled with the implications of humanity's example. If a species could achieve such advanced capabilities while maintaining such fundamental decency, what did that say about the nature of intelligence itself? Some scholars argued that humans represented the next stage of galactic evolution, Zekthar continued. That they were what all intelligent species could become if they chose cooperation over competition, creation over destruction, love over fear. Others had suggested that humans were unique, possessing some quality that other species lacked and could never acquire. This perspective had been discouraging to species hoping to achieve similar levels of technological and social development. But Dr. Chen had shown me evidence that disproved that theory, Zekthar said. Human historical records revealed that they had been just as aggressive and destructive as any other species during their early development. Their transformation had been a choice, not an inherent characteristic. The choice had been driven by crises that forced humanity to confront the consequences of their aggressive tendencies. Global wars, environmental destruction, and social inequality had brought their civilization to the brink of collapse. Only by choosing cooperation over competition had they managed to survive and eventually thrive. They had faced the same challenges that every intelligent species encounters, Zekthar explained. The question was whether they would allow those challenges to destroy them or would use them as opportunities to become better than they had been. The human choice had been to become better, to evolve beyond their aggressive instincts and create a civilization based on mutual benefit rather than competitive advantage. Their success had proven that such evolution was possible for any species willing to make the necessary changes. That was their true gift to the galaxy, Zekthar said. Not the technology, not the defensive systems, not even the peaceful transformation of interstellar relations. Their greatest gift was proof that change was possible, that intelligence could transcend its origins, that any species could choose to become better than it had been. The proof had inspired transformation movements throughout the galaxy as civilizations sought to follow humanity's example. The results had been variable, with some species achieving remarkable progress while others struggled to overcome ingrained patterns of thought and behavior. But even the struggling species had made progress, Zekthar noted. The human example had established new standards for what intelligence could achieve, new goals for civilizations to pursue, new definitions of success that went beyond mere survival and expansion. The long-term implications were still being discovered as galactic civilization continued to evolve along the paths that humanity had opened. Research into consciousness, creativity, and cooperation had revealed capabilities that no species had previously suspected they possessed. We learned that intelligence has depths we had never explored, Zekthar said. Focusing on aggression and competition had prevented us from developing other capacities that were far more valuable in the long term. As the interview continued in the sterile chamber of Kepler's 7 station, Zekthar found himself reflecting on the profound changes that humanity had brought to his own life and to galactic civilization as a whole. The transformation had been so complete that it was difficult to remember what life had been like before encountering humans and their revolutionary approach to interstellar relations. The final revelation had come during Zekthar's last assignment with the Human Exploration Service, 3 cycles before this interview on Kepler's 7 station. The mission had been routine by human standards, investigating anomalous energy signatures detected in the outer spiral, a region of space so remote that no known civilization had ever established a permanent presence there. We discovered something that changed my understanding of everything the humans had done, Zekthar said, his voice taking on a tone of profound awe. Something that revealed the true scope of their plan for galactic civilization. The exploration vessel New Horizons had approached the source of the energy signatures with standard scientific protocols. The crew, representing 7 different species working in perfect harmony, had expected to find natural phenomena, perhaps a pulsar with unusual characteristics or a stellar nursery producing unexpected radiation patterns. Instead, they had discovered a construction project on a scale that defied comprehension. It was a city, Zekthar said simply. A city in space, larger than most inhabited worlds, built using technologies that exceeded even human capabilities as we understood them. But it wasn't human construction. It was something else entirely. The city had been inhabited by beings that could only be described as post-biological, entities that had transcended physical existence while retaining individual consciousness and creativity. They had evolved beyond the need for planetary environments, drawing energy directly from stellar phenomena and organizing matter at the quantum level. They welcomed us, Zekthar continued. Not with suspicion or hostility, but with genuine delight at encountering representatives of what they called ascending civilizations. They had been monitoring galactic development for millions of years, waiting for species to reach the point where contact would be beneficial rather than harmful. The post-biological entities had observed the human intervention in galactic affairs with approval and satisfaction. According to their perspective, humanity had achieved something unprecedented, the successful guidance of an entire galactic community toward cooperative rather than competitive development. They explained that most galactic civilizations destroy themselves through warfare and resource depletion before achieving the cooperation necessary for transcendence, Zekthar said. Humans had managed to break that pattern not just for themselves, but for everyone. The entities had been waiting for this development for eons, preparing resources and knowledge that could only be safely shared with civilizations that had chosen cooperation over competition. The human success in transforming galactic culture had finally made such contact possible. They offered to help us take the next steps in our development, Zekthar explained. Technologies that could extend life indefinitely, enhance consciousness, and allow us to explore dimensions of existence we had never imagined. But only if we continued to demonstrate the cooperative principles that humanity had established. The offer had come with the same conditions that characterized all human technology: it could only be used for beneficial purposes, and it would cease to function if employed for aggressive or exploitative ends. The safeguards were even more sophisticated than those built into human systems, responding not just to actions but to intentions and underlying motivations. I realized that the humans had known about these entities all along, Zekthar said. Their entire intervention in galactic affairs had been designed to prepare us for this contact. They had been working toward a goal far grander than anything we had imagined. The post-biological entities had confirmed this understanding. Humanity's departure from known space had been coordinated with them, part of a carefully planned transition that would allow younger species to develop independence while still receiving guidance when needed. The humans had graduated, one of the entities had explained. They had achieved the level of development necessary to join the community of transcended civilizations. But they had chosen to remain connected to their origins, continuing to help species like yours reach the same level of achievement. The revelation had profound implications for understanding human behavior throughout their contact with galactic civilization. Their apparent technological superiority had been real, but it had been based on guidance from beings whose capabilities exceeded anything that physical existence could support. They had been students as well as teachers, Zekthar said. Learning from the entities while teaching us, developing their own capabilities while helping us develop ours. Their success had been based on cooperation not just within their own species, but with intelligences that had transcended species entirely. The human model of transformation had been tested and refined through contact with the post-biological entities. Their techniques for converting aggression into cooperation, their technologies for eliminating scarcity, their methods for promoting peaceful development had all been developed with guidance from beings who had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. But the humans had added something unique, Zekthar continued. The entities were impressed by humanity's emphasis on preserving individual identity and cultural diversity while promoting cooperation. Most transcendent civilizations had achieved unity by abandoning individual differences. Humans had managed to maintain both cooperation and diversity. This achievement had made humanity valuable partners for the post-biological entities, who had grown concerned about the loss of creativity and innovation that often accompanied transcendence. Human civilization offered a model for advancement that preserved the qualities that made intelligence interesting and unpredictable. The entities asked us to carry a message back to galactic civilization, Zekthar said. An invitation to join a community that spans multiple galaxies and includes intelligences we can barely comprehend. But only when we're ready, only when we've proven that we can cooperate not just within our own galaxy but with forms of consciousness that challenge our understanding of what intelligence can become. The message had been simple but profound: continue developing along the paths that humanity had established, prove that cooperation could be maintained even as capabilities expanded beyond current limitations, and eventually contact would be established that would open new dimensions of existence and understanding. The choice is ours, Zekthar said. We can continue to grow and develop according to human-inspired principles, eventually earning a place in a community that includes the most advanced intelligences in the universe. Or we can revert to competitive and aggressive patterns and remain isolated until we either destroy ourselves or find the wisdom to choose differently. The responsibility had been overwhelming. Galactic civilization held the future not just of individual species, but of the potential for consciousness itself to continue evolving toward forms of existence that transcended current understanding. That's when I understood why the human battlefront had been pure hell, Zekthar said quietly. Not because of the destruction or the defeat or the humiliation of our military forces. It was hell because it forced us to confront the gap between what we were and what we could become. The humans had shown galactic civilization a mirror that reflected not just their current primitive state, but their potential for transcendence. The gap between the two had been so vast that it had challenged every assumption about intelligence, progress, and the purpose of existence itself. We had spent millennia believing that we were advanced civilizations, Zekthar continued. But, compared to what intelligence could achieve, we